Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Welcome to Founder of the Day, Federalist Read Along. We are going to be reading Federalist number 20, line by line. Try and dissect that old 18th century language, get it up to par for today so we can learn about it a little bit. I'm a little loud. Turn myself down a little bit so I don't crack out the microphone. And let's get right to it. I'm going to pull up this screen here, and you're going to read along with me. Now, again, this is Federalist number 20. This is written by James Madison, though this is one of a handful in a row that seemingly had... Hamilton was probably in the room for most of the time he was at least conceiving the authorship of this paper, as well as the preceding two. If you've been through the preceding two, you will know that actually the preceding three, this is the sixth article about the same topic. They are, on the surface, as it says here, talking about the insufficiency of the Articles of Confederation to preserve the union of the states, though primarily it's been a bit of a history lesson now, hasn't it? This is the last one of these where we're going through history lessons. Now, they are a lot of fun to learn history from historical figures, but they are a little bit distant from the point of proving why the United States Constitution should be ratified in the late 1780s. I mean, we see what they're going for, as you see. If you've been here before, you'll know. We dissect the arguments for and against as we go. December 11th, 1787, leading up to Christmas. And as I said, it's James Madison with help from Hamilton, though it is, I have seen it credited as both. This is written by James Madison. Most historians agree. Just Hamilton was there helping out. And let's go. This one is going to be talking about the United Netherlands, aka the Dutch, aka people who James Madison and the union they're trying to assemble owed a lot of money to at the time for helping to pay for the Revolutionary War. Additionally, it is one of the few that they've discussed. They've been discussing historical republics. Now they're talking about a republic that was a contemporary of theirs. Like I said, John Adams had gone there to borrow money for the Revolutionary War. They were an important part of Europe, a smaller nation, but an important one, and a republic of separate states. Sometimes we refer to Netherlands as Holland, but Holland is just one of the many states. So, without further ado, let's get into it and see what he has to say about the Netherlands. So, to the people of the state of New York. And before I start, I want to remind you, I do have a link in the description below if you want to read along. And we will go line by line. Let's do it. Netherlands. The United Netherlands are a confederacy of republics, or rather, of aristocracies of a very remarkable texture, yet confirming all the lessons derived from those which we have already reviewed. So again, he's referencing the previous several papers, Federalist papers, that did discuss historical markers and some of the issues with republics when it comes to keeping them united. So, he's saying the Netherlands are a confederacy of republics, or rather aristocracies. So the republics, the states of Netherlands, as he's implying here, unlike the states in the United States, the states in Netherlands were quasi-monarchical, constitutional monarchy style republics, which is different than the states, but let's continue. Let's talk about it. So, the Union is composed of 7 co-equal and sovereign states, and each state or province is a composition of equal and independent cities. So, pretty self-explanatory on the surface. 7 states in the one union of the Netherlands, and they have equal and independent cities, which is interesting. It's hard to make cities equal on purpose. That must be accident of history, so to speak, for the cities to be equal. It seems like he's referencing in population and style of government. In all important cases, not only the provinces, but the cities must be unanimous. So because the Netherlands states are much smaller, both geographically and in population, then as now, the cities have the most people, so therefore the cities have to be in agreement for changes to be made. And again, one of the points of the Federalist Papers and this series we're discussing of Federalist Papers is that the Articles of Confederation are not working because you need unanimous consent between the states. And I would presume we're about to talk about how unanimity between the 7 states of Netherlands is tough. Imagine how hard it would be for 13 states. The sovereignty of the Union is represented by the States General, consisting usually of about 50 deputies appointed by the provinces. So each province or state of the Netherlands gets to appoint a handful of deputies that goes to the States General, the top legislature, if you will. They hold their seats, some for life, some for 6, 3, and 1 years. From 2 provinces, they continue in appointment during pleasure. So, they all hold different amounts of time. This seems to be because it's left up to the states to decide how they want to represent themselves. Not dissimilar to how the Articles of Confederation worked. In the Continental Congress, the states just chose who they wanted to go, and they would choose how they wanted to choose the people they chose. Sorry for repeating myself, but that's essentially what he's saying here. So some for during pleasure, that's interesting. They just say, you're the representative for our state. Go forever. The States General have authority to enter into treaties and alliances, to make war and peace, to raise armies and equip fleets, to ascertain quotas and demand contributions. And for anyone popping in late, we are talking about the Netherlands, the Republic of the Netherlands, at the time James Madison is writing. So these are many things that essentially the Articles of Confederation were able to do. Treaties and alliances, that was an agreement. That's why they had Jefferson and Adams and others, John Jay, overseas for a time, making these treaties. To make war and peace, obviously, to treaties that would end wars or start wars, raise armies and equip fleets. Now, the Continental Congress did raise an army in haste, but the Articles of Confederation didn't really have the ability to raise an army. It did have the ability to man forts. There were certain forts that were considered federal, even though they weren't, and they were actually manned by the Continental Congress. Not really the Continental Army at this point, but they were in charge of certain forts. To ascertain quotas and demand contributions. So the Articles of Confederation, they could demand contributions. They weren't met, but they could demand it. In all cases, however, unanimity and the sanction of their constituents are requisite. So not only I don't think he means the delegates need to agree, but the delegations of each state need to be unanimous in the decision, and they need the actual cities to approve as well. That's a lot of people that you need to get things done. They have authority to appoint and receive ambassadors, to execute treaties and alliances already formed, to provide for the collection of duties on imports and exports, to regulate the mint, with a saving to the provincial rights, to govern as sovereigns the dependent territories. Again, a lot of this is fairly self-explanatory. I don't want to harp on it too long, but the States United, or the States General, sorry, they are the ones who are supposed to do everything internationally, essentially. They also have the right to regulate mint, so to make coins and currency, which is interesting. At the time, this was left up to separate states under the Articles of Confederation. They did make the Continental as kind of a wartime effort, and that went very, very poorly. The provinces are restrained, unless with the general consent, from entering into foreign treaties, from establishing imposts injurious to others, or charging their neighbors with higher duties than their own subjects. So that's interesting. This is not something the Articles of Confederation did. It's actually something they're promoting in the Constitution. Entering into foreign treaties? No, we are one united body when it comes to foreign nations, which was supposedly true under the Articles of Confederation. From establishing imposts injurious to others, that was not true. You could definitely, New York could establish import taxes that could hamper New Jersey or Connecticut, which has been discussed both in earlier Federalist papers and in some of the Anti-Federalist papers, and charging their neighbors with higher duties than their own subject. Essentially the same thing, which would come, the federal government would resolve that issue when the Constitution was ratified. A Council of State, a Chamber of Accounts, with 5 colleagues of Admiralty, aid and fortify the federal administration. So this federal, as he's calling it, a federal administration, the highest body of the Netherlands government, has a Council of State, a Chamber of Accounts, with 5 colleagues of admiralty. So essentially, two small councils and 5 soldier generals. They have the ability to, they're kind of the bureaucracy, essentially, of the Dutch Republic. The executive magistrate of the Union is the stadtholder, who is now an hereditary prince. Side note, notice it's an hereditary. That is how they used to write. Technically, when you write a word that starts with H but emphasizes a vowel sound, like history or honesty, you are supposed to say an and not a. That's just a pet peeve of mine. Let's continue with what we want to talk about here. The executive magistrate is the stadtholder. So that's the name of the person in charge of the entire union. I believe that is also the name of the people running each individual state. Kind of like if you called the governor of a state a president and also called the president of the United States president. I'm pretty sure that's how they use the word stadtholder. Either way, he is an hereditary prince. So Netherlands was technically a constitutional monarchy. There was a hereditary king. Well, he calls him a prince, but a king in all but name, who did inherit the title, but with certain serious regulations. And this looks to be a pretty lengthy sentence. His principal weight and influence in the Republic are derived from this independent title, from his great patrimonial estates, from his family connections with some of the chief potentates of Europe, and more than all, perhaps, from his being stadtholder in the several provinces, as well as for the Union, in which provincial quality he has the appointment of town magistrates under certain regulations, executes provincial decrees, presides when he pleases in the provincial tribunals, and has throughout the power of the pardon. Woo, I couldn't get those words out, huh? That's a really lengthy sentence. Now, I want to note, I did make a mistake earlier talking about stadtholder. I was right that each state had stadtholder as its executive, but it turns out that the executive of each state was also the same prince who was executive of the states as a whole. That's fascinating. So he was both, a comparison to today, he would be both president of the United States and governor of all 50 states. That's a pretty weighty title. Now, there's some important things here. They say the weight and influence is, not only is he independent, so he can make decisions without kind of worrying about election and do what he thinks is right, though we judge monarchy for just that reason. He can make decisions he thinks are right. That's totally wrong, and no one can do a whole lot about it. But his relationships and family connections with the rest of Europe. And that was really important to Europe at the time. Europe was still entrenched in aristocracy at this time. And therefore, having cousins who were kings of other nations was important to keep the peace, like it or not. That is how Europe worked for centuries. More than all, perhaps, being stadtholder. Okay, so he can appoint town magistrates. Okay, so he can actually make appointments at a very local level, which is more than you would expect for something calling itself a republic. As stadtholder of the Union, he has, however, considerable prerogatives. Okay, not much to emphasize there. What are these prerogatives? In his political capacity, he has authority to settle disputes between the provinces when other methods fail, to assist at the deliberations of the States General and at their particular conferences, to give his audiences to foreign ambassadors, and to keep agents for his particular affairs at foreign courts. So, a lot to unpack in that little sentence. When other methods fail, he can help settle disputes when other methods fail. So if the Estates General can't settle disputes between the different states, he can step in and settle it himself. He can assist in their deliberations, so he can go and be a part, as opposed to the United States, where the president is executive and legislature is Congress. In the Netherlands, the Republic, the prince can go and be a part of the legislature. He might not make the decisions there, but he can assist. Although I guess that's not terribly distant from how the president operates today. I don't mean a particular president. I mean the presidency at large over the last century or so does have a hand in swaying the direction of Congress, but doesn't actually make the laws. To give his audience to foreign ambassadors. So again, he's the prince. So foreign ambassadors, sending ambassadors to foreign courts, having foreign ambassadors come talk to him. That makes sense as the chief executive. In his military capacity, he commands the federal troops, provides for garrisons, and in general regulates military affairs, disposes of all appointments from colonels to ensigns, and of the governments and posts of fortified towns. So he's the chief executive. He's commander-in-chief. That is something you would expect from the top person in the executive branch in almost every government. In his marine capacity, he is an admiral general. I can never get that word out. I always say admirable. In his maritime capacity, he is admiral general and superintends and directs everything relative to naval forces and other naval affairs, presides in the admiralties in person or by proxy, appoints lieutenant admirals and other offices, establishes councils of war whose sentences are not executed till he approves them. So much like we just said for the military, same thing at sea. The commander-in-chief is the commander-in-chief. Excuse me. His revenue, exclusive of his private income, amounts to 300,000 florins. I'm going to get through the lesson. The standing army which he commands consists of about 40,000 men. So I presume florins are or were the currency of the Netherlands, exclusive of his private income. So the hereditary prince actually gets paid for his job, 300,000 florins, which is weird. I'm pretty sure the president gets paid $200,000 today, so that's strangely close. Although I don't know the value of florins over time. I don't know. That might be 100 million florins at this point. I'm not sure. But it's interesting he notes exclusive of his private income, because he probably made a whole lot of money as a prince on his private income. And the standing army consists of about 40,000 men. That's an interesting note, too, that he would know that. Again, Madison and Hamilton have been talking in the last several papers about history, examples in history of republics. This is a contemporary. They have 40,000 men at this point. The Continental Army, I don't know the exact number. It's always hard to determine what the Continental Army had, but I don't believe the Continental Army ever exceeded 20,000 people at any one point in the war. And from my understanding, I don't have the notes in front, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but if I'm recalling correctly, that includes like militias. So it's about twice what the American army was. Granted, they were in the Netherlands, and that's surrounded by Europe, which often had wars. But just suffice to say, that's a really big army for the time. Such is the nature of the celebrated Belgic Confederacy as delineated on parchment. So the Belgic Confederacy seems to be the name of the United Netherlands at the time, as delineated on parchment. So that's how it's written down. That's what their constitution says. I have a feeling things are a little different, aren't they? What are the characters which practiced has stamped upon it? So constitutionally, this is what it's supposed to do, but what really happens? Imbecility in the government, discord among provinces, foreign influence and indignities, a precarious existence in peace, and peculiar calamities for war. Imbecility in government, so a stupid government, like literally saying a stupid government. Discord among the provinces, so these United States, they have troubles between each other. Foreign nations are embarrassing the Netherlands and getting involved in their private affairs, and precarious existence in peace. So they have peace sometimes, but it's hard to hold on to. It was long ago remarked by Grotius that nothing but the hatred of his countrymen to the House of Austria kept them from being ruined by the vices of their constitution. I don't know who Grotius is. Sounds like an ancient Greek name, but he's referencing Austria, which was not around in ancient Greece. If you know who Grotius is, throw it in the comments, let us know. was long ago remarked, nothing but the hatred of his countrymen to the House of Austria kept them from being ruined by the vices of their constitution. So, the I guess Austria he's referencing here, the nobility in Austria hated the people that lived under their power, and therefore all the problems with their constitution was overlooked because they were so mean to the people who lived there. Weird little aside there, Mr. Madison. The Union of Utrecht, says another respectable writer, reposes an authority in the States General, seemingly sufficient to secure harmony, but the jealousy in each province renders the practice very different from the theory. So Utrecht is in the Netherlands, FYI. It seems like the government of the United Netherlands can control the people. It works in harmony, as he says, but jealousies between the provinces. This is a thing that Madison and Hamilton kept going back to. Jealousies between the separate states, the separate provinces, because, oh, look what they have, I want that, or oh, vying for power is essentially what he means by jealousies. It means in the Netherlands, in practice, things work very different than their constitution says it should. The same instrument, says another, obliges each province to levy certain contributions, but this article never could, and probably never will be executed, because the inland provinces who have little commerce cannot pay an equal quota. So each province in the Netherlands is supposed to buck up and help pay for the nation, but as he's saying here, the Netherlands is on the Baltic Sea, many of the states, but some of them are not, and not having access to those waterways really hampers their trade, as you can imagine. This is kind of a small reference to some inland states that don't even exist yet at this point, although Kentucky already was applying for statehood, and Vermont already was applying for statehood, and they have no access to the oceans. Kentucky has the Mississippi. Let's not get too sidetracked. So he's saying that not everyone could pay an equal quota even if they're supposed to. That's what the Constitution says, but in practice it can't happen. In matters of contribution, it is the practice to waive the articles of the Constitution. So they literally just ignore their Constitution because they can't obey it. The danger of delay obliges the consenting provinces to furnish their quotas without waiting for the others, and then to obtain reimbursement from the others by deputations which are frequent or otherwise as they can. So the wealthier states that are on the seaside, they pay for their neighbors that can't afford it, but then they try and get some of that money out of them. And they're saying, hey, give us that money. You owe us money. The great wealth and influence of the province of Holland enable her to effect both of these purposes. So Holland is usually, when you think of the Netherlands, most people who can name one of the United Netherlands can name Holland. And Holland, I don't mean you, students of history, I mean the general public, of course. Because Holland has so much weight, they are the most powerful state. And that's why people know its name. And it was essentially able to run things if they want to. Holland could convince some of the other more powerful states to brush aside the Constitution, but could also try and claim some money that was owed from the other states. And this seems to be a very long sentence. It has more than once happened that the deficiencies had to be ultimately collected at the point of the bayonet, a thing practicable, though dreadful, in a confederacy where one of the members exceeds in force all the rest, and where several of them are too small to mediate resistance, but utterly impracticable in one composed of members, several of which are equal to each other in strength and resources, and equal singly to a vigorous and preserving defense. So this is kind of an aside to other things that were said in both Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers, that if people will not or cannot voluntarily comply with the laws, then they will be, some would argue need to be, I'm not arguing that, some would argue need to be, forced into compliance. And that's what he's saying here at the point of a bayonet. And he's implying that, hey, look, it's the more powerful states forcing these smaller states to do things that they literally can't do. And that could lead to horrible things. Okay. Oh, you know what? There's more to it. Let me finish up this. Where several of them are too small to mediate resistance, so they can't protect themselves, but utterly impractical, composed of several members. So ones that are equal in strength to each other, but vigorous in preserving defense. So they would need to get all the smaller states need to come together and defend each other against the more powerful state that's pushing these policies. And of course, that essentially would be a civil war within the Dutch Republic. Not something he's saying has happened, but saying, well, actually, he is saying it's happened. He doesn't outright call it a civil war, but be afraid of it. Foreign ministers, says Sir William Temple, who was himself a foreign minister, eluded matters taken ad referendum by tampering with the provinces and cities. William Temple was an Englishman who lived about 100. He died about 100 years before Madison is writing this. He did do some foreign ministering, but he was mostly known for his essays, a lot of which concerned things of this nature. In 1726, the Treaty of Hanover was delayed by these means a whole year. Instances of a like nature are numerous and notorious. So there are numerous instances, and he's referencing one very quickly, the Treaty of Hanover. It's eluding me what that particular treaty did. There are a lot of treaties in the history of Europe. Forgive me for not memorizing every single one of them. I know most of the ones in the United States history, but that's a little bit easier. It's shorter. In critical emergencies, the States General are often compelled to overleap their constitutional bounds. So, we got someone crying real quick. You know what? I'm going to pause real quick. I will return to you in just a second. Time out. I'm back. I'm sorry about that. As usual, one of the cats kicked open the door, and one of the little boys is not happy it's bedtime. Anyway, in critical emergencies, the States General are often compelled to overleap their constitutional bounds. So he is essentially repeating himself here, saying that sometimes the federal government just skips over the federal constitution and does what it wants. In 1688, they concluded a treaty of themselves at the risk of their heads. So the federal government in Netherlands came up with a treaty, but it was not approved by the separate states, which it was supposed to be. The Treaty of Westphilia in 1648, by which their independence was formally and finally recognized, was concluded without the consent of Zeeland. Okay, so Zeeland, one of the provinces, did not jump in. Someone left because I left. I apologize. Treaty of Westphilia, 1648. I think we talked about this last week too. It was really two treaties that happened in 1648 that ended the 30 Years' War and the 80 Years' War, which were two separate wars kind of being fought throughout Europe at the same time. Even as recently as the last treaty of peace with Great Britain, the constitutional principle of unanimity was departed from. So again, they're all supposed to agree according to the Constitution, but they gave up on that. A weak constitution must necessarily terminate in dissolution for want of proper powers or the usurpation of powers by the requisite for public safety. So if your constitution isn't strong enough, it's going away. It's not going to stay around. Whether usurpation, by the way, usurpation, one of my favorite words, it's in the Declaration of Independence. It's just the assumption of power, essentially a coup. Whether the usurpation, when once begun, will stop at the salutary point or go forward to dangerous extreme must depend on the contingencies of the moment. So, if a coup happens, it will either stop when the people throwing the coup realize it's time to stop and make everything good, or it will keep going and accumulating power until something terrible happens to the nation. tyranny has perhaps oftener grown out of the assumption of power called for on pressing exigencies by a defective constitution than out of full exercise of the largest constitutional authority. So, this is a really important statement. Tyranny, dictatorship, authoritarianism, perhaps oftener, as he said, or usually comes out of the assumption of power when there's an emergency. It's not usually that the Constitution's there and the Constitution is abused and dictatorship happens. No, usually it's when the Constitution is ignored in an emergency or exigency. Okay, I'm not even going to try and say it. I know the word, I just can't get it out of my mouth. Okay. Notwithstanding the calamities produced by the stadtholdership, it has been supposed that without his influence in the individual provinces, the causes of anarchy manifest in the Confederacy would long ago have dissolved it. So, okay, so he's saying that the stadtholder, the prince that we were discussing before, doesn't hold power, like he's not powerful enough, apparently. And because he's a weak executive, he cannot control the anarchy within the separate provinces. Notwithstanding the calamities produced by the state, it has been supposed that without his influence, the individual provinces... I'm sorry. Let me say this again. He is powerful, and because that makes more sense. He has all the military and navy. Because he's so powerful, he's able to hold these states together despite the fact that they have internal jealousies and arguments between each other. So it's this powerful executive that keeps this republic together. Where's the end of it? Under such a government, says the Abbé Malby, the Union could never have subsisted if the provinces had not a spring within themselves capable of quickening their tardiness and compelling them to the same way of thinking. So if they didn't have this powerful executive holding them, gluing them together, then they would not have lasted nearly this long. Which again, he referenced, it was 1848, the Treaty of Westphilia. So they've been around about 150 years when he's saying this. This spring is the stadtholder. Oh, I'm sorry. That's the same quote from before. I should have gone through the whole quote. So, again, it's the same thing. It is remarked by Sir William Temple that in the intermissions of the stadtholdership, Holland, by her riches and her authority, which drew the others into a sort of dependence, supplied the place. So, when a prince passes away, they need to find a new prince, even though it's hierarchical. Oftentimes there's no male heir and it's a little tenuous. Holland just steps in and takes over and says, we're in charge now till we figure this out. Because they're powerful and the other states are dependent on them. These are not the only circumstances which have controlled the tendency to anarchy and dissolution. So, again, he's saying that the Dutch Republic tends toward anarchy and dissolution, but it's not just the prince that holds them together. What else is it? The surrounding powers impose an absolute necessity of union to a certain degree. At the same time that they nourish by their intrigues the constitutional vices which keep the Republic in some degree always at their mercy. So, because there's these giant nations everywhere around the Netherlands, they're kind of forced to stick together, or they might be taken or invaded by one of these powerful nations. While it notes, at the same time, these other nations are quietly causing the problems, being agent provocateurs, if you will, causing the problems that divide the states. So other nations are intentionally keeping the states of the Netherlands divided, but they need to stick together despite their divisions to fight off these other nations. And they do that largely, as he mentioned, due to the authority of the prince. Okay, we got some capital letters. I did not make these bold. Jamie Madison did. The true patriots have long bewailed the fatal tendencies of these vices, and have made no less than 4 regular experiments by extraordinary assemblies, convened for the special purpose to apply a remedy. Sorry, I went too far. Love the word bewailed. Gonna throw that out there. Got to start using that. That's the word of the week now. The true patriots have bewailed it with 4 extraordinary assemblies, which means extra legal bodies, essentially, kind of like the Constitutional Convention. Wink, wink. Although they were called together legally, the Constitutional Convention, as it seems these were, but they were outside the government, almost exactly like the Constitutional Convention. As many times as their laudable zeal found it impossible to unite the public councils in reforming the known, the acknowledged, the fatal evils of the existing Constitution. So they called these councils together, these assemblies together, because there were known problems and they could not unite all of the states under one banner. They had so much trouble doing it, so they called in these conventions. Sound familiar? Articles of Confederation couldn't unite the states to get done what they needed to get done. They called in an assembly of people who, some were, but primarily were not in the government at the time, to come up with a solution. But they had 4 of them, and the United States at this point only had 1, and that was kind of, it seems to be the point he's alluding to here. Let us pause, my fellow citizens, for one moment over this melancholy and monitory lesson of history. And with the tear that drops for the calamities brought on mankind by their adverse opinions and selfish passions, let our gratitude mingle an ejaculation to heaven for the propitious concord which has distinguished the consolations of our political happiness. Okay. Didn't know it was going to get hot and heavy in here. I apologize for James Madison. Again, what he's saying here is, let's take a breather. He's literally stepping back from his argument and saying, hey, we're looking at all these history lessons over the last few weeks. We're looking at what's happening in contemporary Netherlands and all these selfish passions. Let's... Our gratitude mingle in ejaculation to heaven. Scream to the Lord, thank you for the unification between the states in America. And it is kind of a good point, is even though the Articles of Confederation and the Continental Congress had trouble uniting the governments to do what needed to be done to run this league, as they called it, under the Articles of Confederation, they did have a lot of concord, as he says. There was a lot of overlap. There was an agreement between most former colonists in approximately how government should operate and how life should go. A design was... Okay, we're going right back to the Netherlands. A design was also conceived of establishing a general tax to be administered by the federal authority. This also had its adversaries and failed. So they tried to establish... They tried to have the federal government, the states general, be able to collect taxes directly from the states and from the people, instead of, say, basically doing exactly... It's very interesting how similar the Articles of Confederation was to the Netherlands Republic. He's essentially saying they tried to raise taxes straight from the people, but it did not, the politicians did not let that go through. Much like under the Articles. Well, I shouldn't say that. They never really tried. The thing is, if they came back from we call it the Constitutional Convention, they called it the Philadelphia Convention, and they were just meant to recommend amendments to the Articles of Confederation. And if they recommended an amendment of direct taxation, there would have been people against it, but maybe not quite so much. That's speculation. I'm just throwing it out there. This unhappy people seem to now be suffering from popular convulsions, from dissensions among the states, and from the actual invasions of forming foreign armies, the crisis of their destiny. I think that's supposed to be destiny, but they spelled things different sometimes back then. What's his name? Daniel Webster had not yet written his dictionary, so there was not a uniform way to write in English quite yet. So he's saying that the people in the Netherlands are now very unhappy. There's dissent among the states. They're being invaded. Again, they were very, very, very wealthy and lent a lot of money to the United States, but I guess that doesn't much matter. All nations have their eyes fixed on this awful spectacle. I am a little bit at a loss here. I'm not sure what invasion he's talking about in the Netherlands at the time. The Netherlands did end up joining the war and fighting against Great Britain with France and the United States and Spain. But in the late 1780s, I will look this up. We'll have a conversation about this at another time. The first wish prompted by humanity is that this severe trial may issue in such a revolution of their government as will establish their union and render it the parent of tranquility, freedom, and happiness. The next, that the asylum under which we trust the enjoyment of these blessings will be speedily secured in this country may receive and console them for the catastrophe of their own. So this is him saying, I hope it works out. The Netherlands was really cool to us. They gave us all this money to help fight the revolution. And now they're having these problems, and hopefully they have a revolution just like ours. It's an interesting wish. France would have one pretty shortly thereafter. And hopefully they get all the blessings of liberty that we have. Take a quick sip of water. I apologize. I make no apology for having dwelt so long on the contemplation of these federal precedents. So, I'm not going to apologize to you for talking about the Netherlands for the last, 40 minutes? Experience is the oracle of truth, and where its responses are unequivocal, they ought to be conclusive and sacred. So this is a phrase I've actually heard several times around reading through the American Revolution. Experience is the oracle of truth. It's like today we might say, we study history so we, don't repeat. What do we say? How do we say it? Study history so we don't make the same mistakes. There's a phrase for it, and it's eluding me, but that's essentially what he's saying. Experience is the oracle of truth. We know things because we've experienced them. And where its responses are unequivocal, they ought to be conclusive and sacred. So where we've seen it, we know exactly what happened. We should say, this is what will happen. Look at the Netherlands. This is what happened. If we do it here, it's also what will happen. The important truth, which it unequivocally pronounces in the present case, is that a sovereignty over sovereigns, a government over governments, a legislation for communities, as contradistinguished from individuals, as it is a solecism in theory, so in practice it is subversive of the order and ends of civil polity, by substituting violence in place of law, or the destructive coercion of the sword in place of the mild and salutary coercion of the magistracy. Publius. The last little bit here is kind of what we were mentioning before. If people if you have too many levels of government and it's too separated from the individual, then the individuals don't know who to respect and who to respond to. It will end with people not knowing what laws to obey or not wanting to obey the laws, and therefore you substitute violence in place of the law. You need to use force to demand compliance instead of using, he says magistracy. I can't read today. It's 18th century language. That's why we're doing this. It's very hard to read. Just to repeat, if you don't have people voluntarily comply, you need to force them to comply, at least if you are the government. And that is it for today. I'm going to pull myself back up. We'll do a little bit of a recap here, okay? So essentially, James Madison goes over his contemporary in the Republic of the Netherlands. He talks about all the divisions between the states and the trouble that the federal government has raising money from the separate states, how it's caused divisions within the states, how some of the wealthier, more powerful states or provinces, specifically Holland, has to essentially bully its neighbors to pay its fair share. And he says how the Netherlands was held together by a really strong prince, and hierarchical prince, so it is a constitutional monarchy, which they are considering a republic. James Madison essentially, they consider themselves a republic. It's like a republic, but the president gets to give it to his sons. But they're extremely powerful. Controls all the military, all the navy. And it's this powerful prince that holds together the separate states, and it's the threat of invasion from neighboring European nations that also help to hold together these states that otherwise would have fallen apart, according to James Madison. Now, the one thing that kept striking me throughout this conversation is he kept saying they ignore their constitution. They keep having problems, and therefore they just ignore what's written in their constitution because that's the only way they can get things done. And as someone who's trying to get people to ratify a constitution, saying sometimes you got to ignore the constitution so your powerful executive can keep things going, it's a very strange sale. Many of these history lesson Federalists that we've done over the last few sessions are very strange arguments to make to try and convince the people of New York that this. Why would I support a constitution that you're literally telling me is probably going to be ignored? Now, to be fair, he is criticizing the Constitution, saying it has to be ignored to get things done, and that's why criticizing the Netherlands Constitution, saying it has to be ignored to get things done, and that's why we need the United States Constitution, which will do things correctly. He's essentially alluding to the Articles of Confederation, which was also really ignored. Though, again, I always like to point out, the Articles of Confederation was not a federal government. It was a federation. It literally says in the first paragraph, it is a league of friendship between sovereign states. You see, well, someone's not happy about it either. I know, it's hard to stomach. But people often misconstrue. I see people online all the time misconstruing the Articles of Confederation as a government. It was not. It was essentially a treaty. It was kind of like the League of Nations. So, and just summing up what we discussed, there's some people popping in at the end here. Sorry, we're just wrapping up. Talked about the Netherlands and their issues. Again, and he really references something that you see more in Anti-Federalist papers than in the Federalist papers, which is the idea that if you want a just government, if you want any government, a government makes laws. And if people don't, you either need people to voluntarily support those laws because they're good laws, they're just laws, and they make things better, or you have to use force and demand they follow your laws. And unfortunately, from James Madison's perspective, what's going on in the Netherlands leads to the forceful enforcement of laws instead of voluntary enforcement. And he is alluding, most of what this paper, as well as the previous few, is doing, they are alluding to the problems under the Articles of Confederation during their discussion of other nations throughout history. And this allusion this time is that if we don't get things going here, if we stick with the Articles of Confederation, there will be divisions between the states. There will lead to the more powerful states demanding their neighbors follow suit. I'm sorry, Delaware, but Virginia and Pennsylvania have decided you need to pay the same amount they do, and they're coming in with their militias if you don't. And in order to prevent that, we need this Constitution where we're all united and we all do it together by apportionment. At the time, apportionment of finances did change under, I think it's the 17th Amendment, but we're not going to get there today. What we are going to do is wrap it up today because we are almost an hour in. This has been a really fun conversation. Thank you for coming. I'm not sure, Daisy, what Vaz Tech means, but thank you for the comment. Anyway, you guys are amazing. I will videos all week long. You know the drill here. If you want to support the channel, check out the Patreon page. I did recently start doing Sunday night live sessions where I have chit-chats with the Patriots on Patreon who support the channel. A bunch of the things I don't have time for, can't fit into videos throughout the week. Little tidbits I've learned along the way, I throw those out there. And I will post a few clips here on YouTube for everyone of the meat and bones of it if I talk about things at length. But in general, it's a nice little hangout, get to know each other, and talk about the American Revolution. So with that, I am going. If you haven't hit like, and if you're new here, you stumbled on this and you like it, definitely subscribe. I put out these Federalist read-alongs once a week. We do trivia. It's going to be on Thursdays this week because Christmas and New Year's and everything, and just a whole bunch of American Revolution all the time. I'm Jason. I will be back with another Founder for you tomorrow.